I'm going to do a little bit of a different talk today and I'm going to do something a bit controversial and go over a series of articles that we've been working on to show you the breadth of our work on COVID-19. This is a collaborative project with Katie Collins at Washington University, Kristen Landivar at University of Maryland, and Buddy Scaraboe at University of North Texas. So I want to talk to you a little bit about COVID-19 and start with some obvious things. So we know that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting women's employment. We know that women have experienced higher job loss and slower recovery than men. We know that women are clustered in the industries hardest hit by the pandemic. And we know that women remain disproportionately responsible for childcare, which makes employment very difficult when schools are closed. And this recession is being called a she-cession based on its disproportionate impact on women. If you look at these data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, sorry, I'm just going to move my screen so I can see this. You can see that I'm going to use my little cursor to show you things. You can see that women's employment has dipped dramatically and is currently at the same rate as 1987. So about 30 years worth of loss in women's employment just under this recession. We know from previous research that mothers are more likely, okay, so what does this mean for parents? And in particular, what does this mean for mothers? So this is a critical question we've been asking through this research. We know from previous research that mothers are more likely to scale back, they're more likely to opt out, and they're more likely to reduce employment when kids are young. We know mothers take a larger share of the household in childcare, and we know that these gaps, the fact that mothers opt out, have very serious long-term economic consequences over the life course, over the duration of their lives. So one of the key questions that was coming at the beginning of the pandemic was, what does the pandemic mean for parents? Some were saying this is going to be a gender revolution. All of a sudden, men are back in the home, and this might kind of spawn new outcomes. I'll show some evidence of that, but by and large, what we're showing is that it's widening gender gaps. So we have published a series of articles, and I'm not going to run through the great details of these because one, I know it'll bore you to death, but two, these are all publicly accessible on my academia.edu page, so that I have them up so you can get them. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what our work is showing and perhaps some policy solutions at the end. So this is the first article we published, and we asked the question, what's happening to parents' employment? Just want to give you the context in which we're running the data. So we are looking at parents' employment at this period of time, February over here. I'm using US restaurant bookings, but you could use anything arbitrarily, and looking at the changes from February, March to April. And what you can see is this was the period in time in which the US economy closed down. We're using data from the US Current Population Survey, and we're looking at those who are dual earners, both employed, married, heterosexual parents. And we're following the same people, so it's a longitudinal panel from February to April. I know that these are a lot of numbers, but I'll walk you through what it's saying. So, and everyone's science people, so this is probably in no way stressful. So these are the results for a dual earner, married, heterosexual households. So these are parents, heterosexual parents. What we're finding is that between February to April, mothers with little kids in the home, 1 to 5, have reduced their work hours by about 1.7 hours. Fathers, no impact. We see mothers with school-age children also reduce their work hours. For fathers, no impact. For those with school-age children, we see both are reducing their work hours, mothers and fathers, by about an hour per week. If you graph these, because we know that mothers tend to work less or fewer hours than fathers in general, you can see that between February and April, that the gap between mothers and fathers widened by 6 hours, 6.3 hours. And again, here for those with little kids in the home. So over time, across these months, a widening in the gender gap. We were interested in what would happen for couples where both could telecommute. So in theory, in a family in which both partners are able to work from home, you should see this gender revolution. We do see for those with older kids, school-age kids, that there is no difference in the work hours. These are not significant. But for mothers with little kids, they dropped their work time by 2.6 hours. Only mothers, not fathers. Fathers' time was intact. Again, just showing you this graphically. These are for couples where both can telecommute. You can see again the gender gap widened, that mothers were reducing their work hours so that it's about 6.4 hours by April in the gap, and just move this again, 6.3 by April for those with little itty bitty kids in the home, school age kids and preschool age children. So what are kind of some of the findings from this? Well, we're showing that the gender gap in work hours grew 20 to 50%. That telecommuting seems to have buffered some of the job loss, but that's not true for those with little kids in the home who reported working fewer hours. After looking at mothers specifically, we wanted to see whether mothers' experiences were distinct from married women more generally, those who are in a married heterosexual couple, but without kids in the home. And so we took the same data over the same period of time. I'm going to skip through this just because I know they're in the interest of time, but I'll just give you the conclusions here kind of more verbally. So what we found for this is that mothers of young children experienced the largest reduction in labor force participation between February and April 2020. Fathers also exited the labor force, but their rates were 1 to 2 percentage points lower. That means that 250,000 more mothers than fathers with children younger than 13 left employment between February and April. When we look at unemployment, we see that women with, so those who were childless and those without children, those with mothers and those without children were facing the largest increase in employment, clearly a she-cession in those first couple months of the pandemic. The unemployment rate for mothers with young children grew by double digits between February and April, with a 9 percentage point increase for those with children under 11, an 11-point increase for those with kids 6 to 12. In terms of work hours, we also again show that mothers with little kids scaled back 3.5 hours between February and March, and fathers scaled back by about 2.5 hours per week. So I hope at this point you're seeing that this is clearly gendered, that mothers are disadvantaged, and that telecommuting does seem to be helping, but it's not for those with little babies, little kids, preschool age kids in the home. One of the things we were interested in is what is the mechanism that's explaining why mothers are being knocked out of employment and the institutional component. And so what we did was we collected, I'm going to talk about my book. And one of the critical things that we thought was critical to mothers' employment was school closure. Now I'm going to plug my book. So I wrote a book. I know you're all giving me a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much. And I wrote this book before the pandemic. And within the book, one of the things that I was really interested in was kind of plotting out the ways in which states varied in their approaches to gender equality and childcare specifically. How did states vary in their support for women's employment and their support for mothers through childcare? And what I found was that there was significant variation across the US states, with states that we often think, so I'm highlighting these ones, are the most progressive, have some of the weakest childcare policies. Most expensive childcare, shortest school days, limited access to after school care. And in these states, mothers are most likely to be out of the labor market. And what I was showing in this book was that actually for mothers, the institutional constraints of where you live in terms of your access to education, but also to childcare infrastructure was really critical in your ability to maintain employment. So I wrote this book, it got published in 2019. And what I didn't anticipate was that a pandemic was going to come and show everyone the very distinct ways in which states function. That although we live in the US, that it matters whether you live in Texas versus California versus Florida versus Nebraska, and in particular in the policies around childcare. So what we did was we collected data on all the public schools. When we published this article, we had 26 states. We collected it at the district level. It's publicly available if anybody wants it. And we selected schools with 500 students in them at least, and we got 9,000 school districts. We then aggregated to the state level and weighted by student population size to make sure that we were weighting it based on the number of students in the state, and then connected it into the current population survey. Comparing parents, mothers and fathers with little kids from 2019, when the pandemic wasn't happening, to 2020 in September through November. What we did first preliminarily was we compared these states, 3 case studies. Maryland, which had mandates for fully remote education, New York, which opted for a hybrid plan, and Texas, which had the majority of state-to-state learning. And we looked at what was happening to mothers' employment. We could see in Maryland, this is fathers, these are mothers. In Maryland, you can see fathers' employment did dip, but not significantly. And we see for mothers in this fully remote state that between 2019 and 2020, mothers' employment dipped, reduced by 16%. We don't see significant drops in New York, a state where it was hybrid between either of these. And we don't see significant drops for those in Texas where things were mostly face-to-face. We then pooled our 26 states to see those that were primarily remote and compared those to who had learning that was in-person or hybrid. And again, you can see those states where learning was primarily remote, mothers were more likely to drop out of employment. Some things to just draw from this is that you can see mothers' employment dropped at higher rates than men. And in the state of Maryland, where things were fully remote, we see a 16% drop. And again, this is evidence that childcare is a critical infrastructure. And without that, childcare and public schooling, there are serious economic consequences, in particular for mothers. So you'll be happy to know that we have subsequently completed our data collection of the first wave. We now have all 25 million elementary students across all 50 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We're in the field right now collecting a second wave of data for April to see what happened across the school year. And let me show you what's happening across the states. This is aggregating up to the state level. You can see remote is here in pink, hybrid is here in yellow, and in-person learning is here in blue. And what you can see is that most of the West Coast states and some of the Eastern Seaboard were operating in fully remote status in September of 2020. You can see that the hybrid is kind of more common in the Northeast, but in-person learning is the most common distribution within the most of the states, and in particular in the center of the country. When we do this at the district level, you can see that there is some variation. Take a state like Texas, where you can see within the state, although most is in person, there are some that went fully remote, but you can see a little bit more heterogeneity across the states. One of the things we were interested in was how does this now link to maternal employment? So this is the gender gap in mothers' employment in 2019. You can see in states where it's 100% school enrollment, no change. But as schools increasingly go remote, more days are remote, more schools are remote, you can see mothers' employment drops. We were also interested in how in-person learning was distributed by the racial composition of the schools. And what we found was that in schools that were predominantly white, they were mostly open in person. In schools with higher concentrations of Hispanic students, we found that they were mostly remote. For those with higher concentrations of Black students, we see that there's a split between in-person and remote learning, but half of them are going to schools that were either hybrid or fully remote. So then I hope at this point what you're getting from our research is that mothers have been knocked out of employment at higher rates under COVID. Childcare, in particular school closures, are really critical to explaining whether mothers were employed or not. And what we did next was we were interested in how are mothers doing emotionally? So this is a huge burden that parents are carrying at this moment in time. What does that mean for their anxiety, sleep, and sense of calm? What I did with colleagues here in Australia was we collected data in the US and Australia over the year in May, right when the pandemic was kicking off and everything was closing, and we re-followed up with people in September 2020. For this paper, we restricted our sample to parents in both countries with about 700 Australians and 600 parents in the US. This is to give you context about what was happening in these two countries during this period of time. So this is before, January 25th, 2020. This is before the pandemic kind of started. And this line is for the new COVID cases in the US, where you can see it kind of increase here into November. Cases were going up. And as we all know, the cases continued to climb past the November 25th, 2020. So this line, if we continued out over time, would keep going up and up and up and up. By contrast, here is the line of COVID cases in Australia. Slight bump in March, then pretty much down to zero, slight bump in August into September in the state of Victoria, and then pretty much ground to zero. So you have two totally different examples. Couldn't have two countries that had polar opposite impacts of COVID-19. We asked people whether they had job changes, if they had their lost their jobs or had their work hours cut, and taking them from May to September. And you can see that basically this is fathers, this is mothers, that fathers experienced a higher percentage of fathers experienced job cuts between September and May, but it's very similar between the Australian fathers and mothers. In the US, by contrast, you can see that fathers maintained higher levels for our sample of job changes over a longer period of time, with American mothers kind of reverting back to the employment between May and September. When we look at changes in childcare and housework, this is housework, and it was pretty much the same pattern for childcare, that in Australia, we see that mothers did pick, higher percentage of mothers picked up more housework and childcare, but we see that Australian fathers carried more housework and childcare for longer periods of time. Whereas in the US, the gender gap kind of reverts, with mothers picking up more of the care by between May and September. So from this, what I want you to see is that Australian fathers picked up more housework and for longer periods of time. American fathers picked up more at the beginning and then dropped their housework and childcare shares, with American mothers filling the gap. What does this mean for anxiety, restless sleep, and calm? In Australia, we see that fathers who had lost their jobs or had their pay hours cut reported worse anxiety, worse sleep, and were less calm. But fathers who picked up more housework and childcare also were more anxious, and they were sleeping poorly. In the US, the only thing associated with fathers' anxiety, restless sleep, and calm is whether they had an economic shock. So whether they lost their jobs or had their pay hours cut. If that would happen to them, they reported worse anxiety and more restless sleep. American mothers look more similar to Australian fathers in that they're balancing these competing demands: job loss, increased housework, and it has a consequence for their anxiety and restless. They're not sleeping well and they're more anxious as a result. So we're showing from this that it appears that Australian fathers may have picked up more and suffered the consequences similar to mothers at this moment in time. The question is whether they're going to carry this larger housework burden into the future, or whether this was temporary. And if we know that housework is critical and childcare sharing is critical to their employment, this is something that's pretty critical to understand. But we're collecting more data as we speak, so we should be able to tell you in a month. So at this point, what I hope you're seeing from our data is that the COVID pandemic did not equalize gender relations, but it disadvantaged mothers. That American mothers are particularly impacted. They're knocked out of employment at higher rates than fathers, and their mental health is impacted by unstable employment and larger domestic loads, and that these experiences vary contingent upon which state they're residing, with those living in states with remote learning particularly disadvantaged. One final paper I'm just going to run through for you all was we were interested in understanding what are the solutions, and in particular policy solutions. So this paper, which came out last year as well, we're interested in this, the impact of Head Start enrollment. And what we were looking to do is benchmark what was happening in the GFC to try to give some evidence-based recommendations for COVID-19 pandemic. So we took the American Community Survey and we took it over 10 years, 2006 to 2016. We took those with families under the age of 5, and we have representation of about 1 million and 1.5 families across all 50 states. And one of the things we're interested in is, how did Head Start enrollment help families stay out of poverty? So we know that childcare is a critical infrastructure, a critical resource to ensure that parents can be employed. But this came through my book too, that Head Start, even though it's a federal program targeted towards low-income families, the ways in which Head Start enrollment is instituted across states varies. And in particular, states, the percentage of available children who are eligible enrolled varies dramatically across states. So if you take a state like South Dakota and North Dakota, almost 190% of the eligible children are enrolled in a Head Start program. If you compare that to a state like Idaho, you see 29%. So there's significant variation across states in terms of this federal program, who can get it and how many kids are enrolled. One of the things we expected was, well, what we found was that in states that had a higher percentage of children enrolled in Head Start, so 100% enrollment, even though they started off at higher poverty rates. So these are the percentage of families living in poverty with young children. So in 2006, they started out with higher poverty rates. That these are flatter curves and quicker returns. If you live in a state where only 20% of children are eligible children can access Head Start, you can see that these states tended to have much higher, more families enter into poverty. This is a GFC period for longer periods of time and slower returns. If you take two states that are very similar in terms of geography and culture, but very different in their Head Start enrollment, like Mississippi and Arkansas. Mississippi has 90% of eligible children enrolled in Head Start. What you can see is that even though it started out at having a higher concentration of families in poverty, that it ends up it declines more quickly than a state like Alabama, where only 47% of families are enrolled in Head Start. So higher growth of families in poverty. Same thing for a state like Arkansas, which had 46% of eligible children in Head Start enrollment, and Oklahoma. Sharper returns to baseline and more quickly. So from this, what we're kind of drawing is that states with higher rates of Head Start enrollment had smaller increases in family poverty during the Great Recession and a more stable economic recovery than those with states with low Head Start. Greater Head Start access reduced the number, prevented many families from falling into poverty. And this provides some evidence that that Head Start, as we're talking right now about critical infrastructure in the US, Head Start is one place in which we can start. And it was an essential resource for those families during the GFC and has the potential perhaps to be one under this current recession. So just kind of in conclusion, what I'm hoping you can see from this is that states have very different institutional contexts, very different childcare structures. And these have really critical impacts on maternal employment. So often we're thinking about how do we manage our childcare demands? How do we function as mothers and fathers while working? And we think about locating that in the family. But what I hope our work is showing you is that it really matters where you live. That mothers living in California are balancing very different institutional structures when making decisions around childcare, when looking to schools being opened, as opposed to mothers in Nebraska. And as my book shows, this has really critical impacts on their employment. Thank you very much.